Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Ogle, and the fourth in a series of election specials for the Watford constituency. And this area, Watford, is a really important constituency. I looked up in the list of marginals, and we're with about a majority of 1,470-ish. We're somewhere in the region of the 60-odd constituency in terms of the level of potential to swap person who is the MP, switch parties as it were, and in actual fact, in the last 74 I thought it was, but Richard Harrington said it was actually longer than that. It's a real bellwether seat, Watford, only not going with the government that ends up being taking the Parliament twice in the last 90-something years or something like that. So a really important one. Today it's the turn of Labour, and I have the pleasure of having Matthew Turmaine with me, who represents Labour. Come and say hello, Matthew.
Hi, Chris. It's fantastic to be here.
Fantastic to have you. And you know, I have to be honest, and when I started looking around at the different candidates that had been put forward, your name wasn't one that's familiar to me, and I suspect that's the case with a lot of people out there in Watford. So what I'd like you to do, if you would, just to start us off really, is to just give us a little bit of a potted history really of how you've come to be in this position now, going back sort of in your early years, and what you've done in the past, etc., which have kind of been your journey to standing for Parliament.
Sure, certainly that sounds like a great idea. Just on the bellwether seats, I thought I'd point out that I believe actually that it was in 1970 was the last time that it did not select an MP of the same colour as the government. So in 1970, I think Labour held it with Raphael Tuck, who was the MP, and of course in 1970 Edward Heath went into Downing Street. So you know that was different. But you're right. Most of the time, in the last 130 odd years that the constituencies existed, it's selected an MP of the same colour of the government. So, but anyway, on to talk about me. So, my name's Matt Turmaine, as you've said. I'm the Labour parliamentary candidate for the general election on the 7th of May, which I'm sure everyone is looking forward to. Certainly, if you're tuned into this, you're probably quite interested. I'm a councillor in West Watford as well, actually, for Holywell Ward. So I've been a councillor there since May 2012 was when I got elected there. Prior to that, I lived in London, and I was very active politically in the Hammersmith constituency. My wife and I moved to Watford some years ago because we wanted to do the family thing and start a family. And frankly, you know, I was working at the BBC at the time, and despite what you may believe, BBC salaries don't really support a lifestyle to be able to afford to stay there. So that's what we did, and we moved to West Watford, and we have a lovely little terrace house, and we adore it. So that's fantastic. When I got here, obviously, you know, I'm quite turned on by community and being engaged and doing stuff, and I guess, you know, what's the raison d'etre about why I bothered to get involved in politics? And I think the reason is I like making things better. Now, that's the kind of jobs that I've done and doing. I like problem solving, and politics is something that I think, you know, could do with a decent problem solving. And you know, that isn't being partisan about it. I think generally speaking, you know, each government in each term of office brings a set of challenges and difficulties that the country is experiencing that people have got to find the right solutions to. And I think I'm part of a party and an organisation that has got the right solutions to the problems that Britain and that Watford specifically is facing at the moment. So what else do I have about connections for Watford? Well, our baby daughter, so we came to Watford to start a family. We did start a family. Our baby daughter was born at Watford Hospital. And you know, that's a really humbling experience, as you can imagine, and anyone who's watching who's got kids will know that as well. It's also really interesting in terms of the experience of what Watford Hospital is like at the moment, some of the challenges that the hospital and the trust are facing, and you know, some of the things that, you know, Labour would do differently. I mean, I think it's pretty reasonable to say that Watford Hospital needs modernisation. It has needed modernisation for some time. since the last time that the Labour Party injected a load of cash into it, actually, when we were in government. But it's something that the coalition parties decided they were going to halt that plan for modernisation when they took office, and it's something that has continued to be a hot topic locally ever since, as I'm sure you're aware. I mean, there's the whole controversy around the health campus and the use of the farm terrace allotment land, or the not use of the farm terrace allotment land. I mean, our position on that, let's be really clear, is we support the allotment holders, and we do not think that you need to use the land for the health campus. I mean, this has been much debated, and but it is nevertheless the case that it has been said by people at a senior position within the trust in the past that that land is not needed to make the health campus take place. They did say that it would make it easier to do so, so it's not quite a binary black and white situation that, you know, perhaps we would like to be able to say about it. But at the same time, you know, we talk about why are people involved in politics. Surely it is possible to be able to rise to the challenge of solving that problem without concreting over those allotments. So the trust also has got some problems in terms of its financial position. I don't know how closely you follow these things, but in the late hours of the night, I sometimes have a read through the board reports, and you know, clearly it's about 15 million in debt already this year. Financial year will obviously finish in April, and that's a big problem because, of course, in order to properly participate in the health campus, it needs to be able to borrow money. It can't do that because it can't achieve foundation trust status, and it can't achieve foundation trust status because of its financial position. So it's a bit of a quagmire. Something is going to happen. It's going through a clinical review. That review may or may not report before the general election, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But certainly from perspective, that's a really big local issue and something that's very important.
And it's been going on for quite a while now, and I've had an interview with Sarah Jane Trabar, who's fronting the Safe.
Oh, she's great. Yeah, she's great, isn't she? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she's great, and we've heard from Dorothy, and we've heard from Richard, both of whom support the health campus in terms of it's a modernisation project. They believe is right for Watford. The interesting point you made there, which is something I'd like to pick up on, is that there is a rumour that there are plans which don't include building on the allotments, which are still viable, but there would need to be a reassessment of the plans and then a resubmission, etc., etc., etc. But it is interesting that, you know, it's more favourable if you build on those allotments because there's more profit or there's more money, or what is the real driver for taking those allotments and building on them if there is a viable plan without building on them?
Mm-hmm. So, as I said, I think that the reality in terms of the financial viability is that certainly using the allotment land would probably make it easier. However, you know, these things don't operate in isolation. You need to look at it in the round. And in terms of the health campus, I mean, I believe that it was actually, you know, the Labour Party, when it was controlling the council, that initiated the health campus project in the first place. Obviously, that was some time ago. And clearly, you referenced the you know, the court case and the ongoing saga that has been trying to deal with it. But again, I think, you know, one has to take, if you're going to be an effective politician in dealing with this, yes, it is about hard decisions, as people say, but it's also about the practicality of solving that problem. And the easiest way to do that and the most practical, sensible way to do that is to look at what can be done that doesn't involve the use of the allotment land for the health campus. Now, it's also my understanding that the county council is interested in that land in terms of potential development of a primary school. Now, if that takes place, then clearly it is not the case that the allotment land would have needed to be used for hospital buildings or for other parts of the health campus. And having looked at some of those plans over the course of the last couple of years, they have changed. You know, none of this is set in stone in terms of exactly what has got to go where. So I think it's probably a failure of the imagination to really fail to be able to deal with it. I'm not in any way pretending that it's a simple, easy, black and white issue, because I don't think it is. But I certainly don't think that it's you know, the case that it needs to be included just off pat because people want it to. And it's almost become like a political hot potato now. You know, it would mean such a lot of you know, face saving to not go ahead with it, that clearly that may be influencing the decision and the behaviour that's going on as well. And also, I need to make it really clear as well, because this is something that's often thrown back at us in terms of our position on the allotment holders. We are totally in favour of the modernisation of Watford Hospital and the renewal of its services there, maintaining the services and facilities that are currently on that site. We are in favour of the idea of the health campus. It's just we think that you have to have that practicality of looking at the precise use of the allotment land.
Yeah, I mean the building and the modernisation of that hospital. It's hospitals are one of those types of things where you have to consume new ground, new areas to replace buildings which can then be knocked down and built to do something else. You can't modernise it as it is because you need it to be operating.
People in there, yeah, absolutely right, yeah. Yeah. But we're not talking about a couple of people getting together who've never done this kind of work before, are we? We're talking about enormous organisations and companies that this is just day-to-day work for. So it's that's a position that we have on it, and I think it's I don't know, it's just disappointing that it's still not solved. I mean, it does tap into very nicely, I think, I don't know if you want to get on to talking about the broader issue of the NHS at the moment, or if we could do that later on, but it does tap in quite nicely to that. I mean, I think it's, it's a fundamental requirement with an expanding population like we have, that infrastructure improves and develops in order to be able to cope with the demands that are placed on it by a growing population. Watford's population is increasing, will continue to do so. So clearly those kind of facilities are going to need to be done. And I think it's also important to say that, from my perspective at least, the only party out there when people are facing a decision on the 7th of May that is going to save the NHS is going to be the Labour Party. We built it originally, we've looked after it under our care, and we've always improved what was going on. So if you go back to '97, for example, when we won the election then, people were waiting 18 months for hospital operations on average. When we were in power, we reduced that to 18 weeks. You didn't have people lying on trolleys in corridors in the kind of circumstances that you do now. And the Health and Social Care Act has been a complete mess. It's made people who work in hospitals, doctors and nurses, into business administrators rather than concentrating on what they're supposed to be doing, which is delivering care. We've also said that our policies for the NHS would be that we would increase the number of nurses by 20,000. We'd get another 8,000 doctors in to be able to do that, and we would meet that because, of course, all of our plans are fully costed, and we've invited the Office of Budget Responsibility to come and check our sums whenever they want to. Those proposals for the NHS more generally would be paid for by a mansion tax and a crackdown on tax avoidance. I mean, obviously, tax avoidance particularly has been a topical issue over the last week or so in the news.
Absolutely, and we'll come onto the more national topics a bit later, but I mean there's relevance there to what we were talking about, as you said. Another thorny issue in Watford at the moment is the Watford market. I don't know how much you know about the market, but I have keeping your ears close to it. But essentially, it's been moved 200 yards up the road, which was expected, I believe, to cause some disruption to the market operation, but what has transpired is it's had a fairly significant, and some would say catastrophic, effect really on what the market is actually doing. And I don't know whether you've been there lately, but there's clearly something that needs to be done about the market. What are your views on it?
So thanks. Yeah, I'm familiar with the market actually. I mean, partly obviously as a result of being a councillor, so opposition councillor at that. But yeah, I'm familiar with it through that. Also, we were talking about my early life. I mean, I grew up near here, so Watford was the first town I came to with my parents, and then when I was a teenager myself, it's the town that you would come to go and entertain yourself and do stuff. So I'm familiar with the market, and I remember it from its previous location from, obviously being much younger. I really liked it where it was, actually. I thought it was a good location for it. Obviously, like everything, it needed some modernisation and some work done on it, and the decision was taken to move it to where it is. Now, having visited it a number of times in its new location, I'm not desperately impressed with how it's been done, and I think that is in no way supposed to be detrimental to the traders who are still there, to the people that are working really hard to make it work. But the problem is, one of the times I went there, it was very soon after it opened. I mean, opening weekend raining and the roof was leaking in the middle of the thoroughfare where people walk through. You know, that's not good. I'm not 100% convinced about the location of some of the facilities there. So, you know, I'm not aware of that many people who particularly want to eat their breakfast next to a flyover. And of course, you get all the fumes coming through from that. And I'm not also persuaded that, you know, the balance of working out how many traders were going to be able to move into the new site was right either, because it's my understanding that there was a great deal of unhappiness about lots of people not being able to move into the new site because it's smaller than the original one. And so, again, I think it shows something of a failure of imagination in terms of trying to make these solutions work. They're not easy decisions to take, and they're not easy pieces of work to get right. But it does seem, you know, it's kind of like it's a project that isn't really finished yet. It's kind of half done, and people are unhappy. Certainly, you know, I'm not going to name any names because it would be inappropriate to do so. But I have spoken to some traders about it, and people generally are not very impressed by it. So yeah, so I don't think it's worked out terribly well, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I'm there probably twice a week, and it's probably true to say that the brunt of the problems that the market has got right now is being funded by traders who are actually losing money. So that clearly needs to stop somehow, and I think it's quite a big relook at how it's going to be funded in what is ostensibly a new market that needs to rebuild its clientele, because it's not, they've not migrated up the road, and you know, the types of offerings in there, it needs to be a destination really, and it's not a destination.
I mean, absolutely. It's like, it's never a fair thing to draw comparisons between different, you know, towns, because circumstances are always so different. But, you know, if you look at what's gone on in somewhere like St Albans and the way that that market works versus what's going on in Watford, I'm not saying you can translate one and just plonk it down in the middle of Watford, but certainly, you know, that works. You've got an enormous amount of activity that is taking place. People go there. It has become a destination. Or it is a destination, and people go there for more than just to buy their, you know, couple of kilos of oranges and whatever else. So, you know, there's a reason to go there that's about socialising. There's a reason to go there which is about, you know, engaging with other people in your community. And I don't think that that's been got quite right this time around.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're gonna move on. There are lots of little other issues which are like, for example, the junction debacle of I don't know how many times they've dug up that area and redone it, but Watford Junction, it's still that whole road situation down there. What do you think he's doing down there?
So the last bit, if you can hear me, the last bit that I heard was the debacle of digging up, and then it stopped. So
okay, so it's
where you're talking about.
Yeah, it's the digging up of Watford Junction, which I think, you know, in 10 years.
Oh man, yes. Yeah. Well, needless to say, I assume that that's what you're going to ask me about. Yeah, I mean, it is a disaster, an absolute disaster, and there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, firstly, where do you start? So the ability of walking out of the junction and being able to get a cab if it's late at night or it's pouring with rain, or you're a single woman on your own, or indeed a single guy on your own at the end of a night out and all this kind of thing, that doesn't work. So the taxi rank thing is abysmal. The amount of space that's been allocated to the bus station, while obviously we are campaigning against the proposed bus cuts that are due to take place so that the consultation is on. But I think that the amount of space that's been allocated to the bus part of that versus the other services that you could have there is wrong as well. I think people are generally unhappy. That little drop off and pick up point that's been put in opposite what was a trade union hall, I mean, that is too small and doesn't really work. You've got the one-way system that has been used there, which is you know, adds something like 15 to 20 minutes. I think people are saying on an average. You know, what is supposed to be flyby to pick up or drop someone off at the station, and so yeah, it hasn't really worked out very well. I mean, you know, and Frank, I mean, it's nice if you've got a bike, I suppose, because, you know, the cycle racks are right outside the station. But that's what, 1 out of about 5 different factors which has been got right. So yeah, not very impressed, to be honest with you. I do use it as well, so it's not something I'm just talking about. It is through personal experience. I mean, and certainly, when you've got a lot of people, when there's a big weight of people trying to queue up for a cab, it's just carnage. I mean, people, they don't understand how the queues work, and arguments break out, and taxi drivers are risking buffeting other cars and all the rest of it. And I mean, there are 2 other issues that I think this could nicely spill into, actually. One is taxi drivers and how the market was flooded with plates, which has, of course, been a disaster for those guys who are trying to make a living out of it. The other thing I think it touches on as well is, of course, we're talking about the station, and since 2010, the average fare of commuting from Watford has gone up by 22% in that period of time. Now, I don't know anyone whose salary has gone up by that, and it's another example of what we're calling the cost of living crisis. It's a ridiculous amount of money to go up, and so one of the proposals that Labour has if we win the general election in May is that we will cap rail fare increases on all routes, and then reform the market in much the same way that we're proposing to do with energy prices as well, because you just can't go on like it. I mean, it's got to be dealt with, and people are paying an ever-increasing share of their salary just to be able to get to work in the first place. So I think the 2 issues are quite closely linked, really.
As we're talking about transportation, I was speaking to someone the other day about the bus services in Watford, and the gentleman concerned had moved out of London, of course, where the bus services are very, very good. And of course, Watford's not the same as London. You can't compare the 2 things. However, it isn't easy if you don't have a car to get in and around Watford on a bus on a reliable service, and the cost of getting around is fairly expensive. I mean, I know that Labour are actually talking about, and there is a discussions at the county level about reducing the bus services, but we should be going the other way, shouldn't we? Shouldn't we be going about helping people get out of cars and get into buses?
Well, correct. I mean, we've campaigned quite extensively around this, as I say, this proposal, the consultation that's out for the proposal to the cuts to the bus services. And the latest iteration is services on Sunday and services after 7:30. I mean, we think that is disastrous. I mean, as you say, there were perfectly good public transport networks in operation, not just in cities like London, but other cities and towns around the country as well. And it's bobbins, if you'll excuse the expression, because people rely on the buses for a number of reasons. It could be that they can't afford a car, and so they need to use the bus to be able to get to work. It might be that they're older and frailer, and so don't want to drive because of the risk, and so they want to take the bus for that. It might be because they just want to make an environmentally sound, ethical choice about how they get about the town and the surrounding areas. And that all seems to me to be perfectly good reasons to be improving and expanding the bus services rather than throwing them into reverse, if you'll excuse the pun. And so yeah, I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's really important to to do that the other way. I mean, and also there's the convenience of being able to use a bus is really important sometimes. I've got as I said, a little girl. And one of the people that we met through, some of the classes that you do to work out how on earth you're going to cope with that experience, they live in a situation, they don't have a car, and the lady's mother wants to be able to go and visit her daughter, not unsurprisingly, to try and help out. Now, the cuts in the bus services will mean that she can't do that anymore. And obviously that journey can't happen in reverse either. So, it's just about making the ability for people to live their lives practically more effective and more efficient, and cuts to those services just complicate and confuse and make those chances harder rather than easier. That doesn't seem to be, government should not be here, whether it's at a local level or a national level, to put more obstacles and more difficulties in the way of people. It should be about greasing the wheels of making everyone be able to live their lives, and I don't think it does that very well.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to move now on to some of the issues that are going to be, people are going to read in the papers and are actually hot potatoes on, the popular programs. But things like, I mean, the NHS. I mean, there's all these rumours of it being privatised or being dealt with in a similar way to the US in terms of insurance-driven stuff. Where do you sit on that? And in relation a little bit to Watford, but in general.
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly, we believe in a publicly funded health service, and the reason that we believe in a publicly funded health service is twofold, I guess. I mean, firstly, because of access. Now, I know that, some of the proposals that other people say for more insurance or privately based services are quote unquote free at the point of delivery, and well, that may be, but it's very easy to then start complicating things that are free at the point of delivery but not delivered through a publicly funded service. And that is something that's very important to us. As I said, we built the NHS, we consistently have to save it. There are doctors and nurses who are saying that it can't survive another 5 years of governance in the way that it's being done at the moment. And of course, Simon Stevens' recent review of the NHS in terms of the recommendations and the requirements that it has in order to be able to keep delivering care chimes really, really closely with what Labour's proposals are and indeed have been prior to that review publishing. So it's so we're not just responding to that. Our thinking is along very similar lines. As I said, our improvements to it in terms of increased nurses and doctors are fully costed in terms of how we'll pay for that. But I think it also taps into how do you make it better, right? How do you make that a service that is fit for the 21st century? And so the proposals that Andy Burnham and Liz Kendall have come up with around a whole person care, properly integrated social care, mental care and physical care are really, really important. So when you have problems like the crisis in A&E that's happened over winter, where you may or may not have read about, waiting times have been up, people can't be processed, ambulance turnaround times go up as a result of not being able to process those people, and so you have serious public health implications taking place on the back of it. That happens partly because there isn't a properly integrated physical, mental and social care infrastructure, because you end up with people who go into A&E, they're processed, they have to be put into a hospital bed, and there's no care for them to be able to be delivered back to home. And so sorting that out will enable us to sort out a lot of the other problems that people are experiencing in their day-to-day use of the NHS. We've also seen that waiting times for GP appointments have been going up again, whereas of course we get them down. The coalition government also scrapped our proposals for a 48-hour maximum wait to be able to see your GP. That remains a Labour policy if we're elected in May. And of course we want to make sure that you're able to do that in a shorter period of time if you have an urgent medical need. And we've also said that we would make the wait between testing and response for cancer a maximum of 1 week. So I think we've got a pretty good set of proposals to save the NHS and, clearly demonstrably fund it publicly. It is also worth pointing out that you sometimes see these stories in the paper that appear where the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, NICE, which kind of is the rubber stamp of what drugs you can use, is saying you can't use this drug or you can't use that drug, which that's compared internationally in some instances. So they'd say, yeah, hey, you go to France, you can use this drug, etc. Now, I think that's unfair, and it doesn't really focus on what the core issue is here, which is a publicly funded health service delivers better care to more people with more success than any of the private outfits in operation that you have in other countries like America and other countries in Europe. So it seems to me that that's a pretty clear correlation, correlation isn't causation, as we all know, but a very clear correlation between a publicly funded NHS and better outcomes and better results of care for people who need to use that service.
Yeah, I mean, I read an article written by a chap who spent a number of years in the US, a number of years in the UK, and he had to undergo treatment and service in both areas, and his conclusion was that the healthcare in the UK, where you can't select the time specifically to suit you in many cases in the UK, but the general outcome in the terms of services was better than he experienced in the US, which was an interesting, unbiased, totally, just this is my experience type post, and I found that quite interesting.
That's fascinating to hear, actually. I mean, it's all very well if you have a health service where you go in and you get a latte and you can have a manicure while we're waiting to have your appendix out, but is that really what people are wanting when they go into a hospital? I would suggest not. I would suggest that they want to know they're going to get decent, proper, high standard quality care close to them and in a way that means that they can get back home quickly and easily afterwards as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, interesting about infrastructure and the strains on infrastructure. One of the another hot potatoes in the upcoming election is going to be immigration and
Yeah.
the whole issue of freedom of movement around and people obviously coming to this country perceived with a view to tapping into our social benefit and social systems. How do you think about that particular topic, which is huge, and what's Labour's position on it?
So it is clearly a really big issue. I mean, I think there are a number of things that I would say about that initially. I mean, I think it's interesting that immigration has become such an issue over the last few years. I mean, I know for some people it has been for a very long time, but to have entered the sort of popular zeitgeist as it has done over the last couple of years, I think partly is symptomatic of the economic circumstances that we find ourselves in. You know, when everyone's got a decent job with proper security and an increasing salary, they tend not to really mind about immigration very much as an issue. So, you know, that's a whole separate conversation about how we make our economy grow better. But in terms of immigration, I think, you know, we've got some tough policies and appropriate policies that we would put into place if we win in May. So, for example, to address your issue about quote-unquote benefit tourism, we're saying that people wouldn't be able to claim benefits for the first 2 years of being here. We believe it's fundamentally important that you pay into a system before you're able to take out of it. And I think also we have a great proposal around apprenticeships, which are linked to immigration, in that if you're a company and you want to employ people from a non-EU country, we are saying that you need to offer an apprenticeship to a British worker as well. Now, why are we doing that? Well, we're doing it because the idea is we cannot win a race to the bottom in terms of our international competitiveness. So we can't just be cheaper and cheaper and cheaper than anybody else in terms of what we do. You know, you can see the competition that we have in Asia and China in terms of being able to not win that race. And so how do you make a set of economic circumstances and employment prospects for people effective in your country where we have fantastic skills and really, really good abilities to be able to bring stuff to bear on the economy? Well, you can do that by increasing people's skills. If you increase people's skills, you increase their salaries and you increase growth within the economy as well. So our immigration policies are very focused around what is better for Britain and what is the point of doing it in order to be able to improve our economy and our prospects for everybody. There are related issues to immigration as well that people have a lot of very valid concerns about. So things like housing and access to housing. The price of housing in Watford has gone up. I think it's 14% in the last couple of years. Rents are clearly going through the roof as well. We've got a set of policies on rent that I think are pretty good, that were fair to both landlords and to tenants. But in terms of housing, we're going to build 200,000 houses per year by 2020. Now, that will help alleviate the cost of housing, the real barrier to entry. When the average age of a first-time buyer is something like 37, then there is clearly something that needs to be done more effectively and better than the current government has been doing so. So I think our proposals will help that. And that's obviously related in part to people's concerns about immigration. We are, of course, in favour of free movement of labour, but I think the worries that people have about free movement of labour are partly mitigated by saying, well, we will have this 2-year period where people are not able to claim benefits. I mean, I think it's also worth pointing out, this benefit to tourism in reality is actually a much smaller issue than, is sometimes popularly presented in the press. And I think that that's worth bearing in mind. And I think, apropos of an interesting statistic, it is my understanding that there are more Brits in European countries claiming benefits than there are other Europeans in Britain claiming benefits. So, you don't often hear that reported, but it's worth pointing out as well. So, so I think we've got a pretty good story to tell on immigration, really.
Excellent. I mean, one of the other thing that there's a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. But one of them that I have had conversations with, although it's not necessarily something that the government could do a huge amount about, but is TTIP, which is the trying to create trade agreements with the US and Europe. But the conversations I've had is about the much more lax conditions of producing food and genetically modified foods, and by enabling these trade relationships to flourish, in a non-democratic environment, i.e. we don't have any say whether they go on and do this or not, brings the risk of having things like bleached chicken, for example, brought into this country and offered for sale, which at the moment is not allowed to be. It's not allowed to be sold. So there's all sorts of things there, and some people don't even know this is going on, by the way. But it's quite an important thing that, you know, that we are not subject to stuff that we haven't agreed happening, really. So I mean, where do you sit on that?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating subject. So, amazingly, bilateral trade agreements can be quite an interesting subject, which you wouldn't necessarily think of initially. But I think it's worth touching very briefly on the background of how we end up in this situation in the first place. So, years ago, we had a system called GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was a universal agreement about how trade is conducted around the world. That expires and run out, and the nations, the economic nations of the world, got together in something called the Doha round to try and sort out the new version of what those agreements would be, and it collapsed and broke down and didn't work. So instead of having an international agreement about trade, what you have is a series of bilateral trade agreements between countries that developed instead. Now, on the one hand, that's a practical way to move forward, because if you can't get a general agreement, well, where can you get agreement? Well, you need agreement to be able to trade. Trade is good. But the problem you have with it is that the terms that countries are subject to in those bilateral agreements tend to favour the bigger, more powerful, wealthier countries. And so you create a set of circumstances around trade that are not mutually beneficial, and not particularly mutually beneficial. And this is a consequence of that. So having gone from country relationship to country relationship, we're now trying to get this TTIP relationship between Europe and America. Now, in principle, you could think this is a brilliant thing. You know, let's have a better trading relationship. Let's make it easier for people to be able to do business together. All really well and good. But the problem is, as you say, that the detail in some of this is quite worrying. So, for example, you know, there's a lot of legalese that describes how this works, but the simple way of describing it, caveated with use the legalese if you're looking at it in detail, is that companies would be able to take governments to court for perceived loss of earnings as a result of decisions that governments have made. Now, what does that mean? Well, to the man in the street, that means that essentially you could have a situation with forced privatisation of the NHS, because you could have a set of circumstances where a company can say to a government, I'm going to sue you, government, because there's potential loss of earnings that I could have made by undertaking the business that you're funding publicly. Now, this agreement is in operation. That part of what TTIP will give us is already in operation to an extent, and this happens if you look in other countries around the world. They are suing governments for loss of earnings, and it is a worry. Now, let me be really clear about this. The Labour Party is absolutely going to exempt the NHS from TTIP should we win the government, should we win the election in May. Really important to make that clear. And we will look very, very closely at what those terms and conditions are in terms of being able to do it. Now, the government today, David Cameron and Nick Clegg, could right now say we want to exempt the NHS from this setup, and we could all go on happily thinking, right, what are the benefits that this trade agreement is going to bring us, without worrying about what the consequences are that are concerning to people. But they won't do it, and they, haven't done it. So they could do it, and they won't. I think that's a pretty clear message that Labour is giving out to the country for those who are worried about it. Now, to address the issue that you're talking about in terms of things like bleaching of chicken and so on, I don't know the detail around that specific example myself, but I do know the principle that's in operation, which is the proposed benefits of the agreement are that you reduce the cost of doing business, so you make it easier for standards to rise. But of course, the fear is that you're actually going to get standards being lowered on both sides of the pond. And interestingly, interest in the UK and Europe tends to be around those kind of food-related issues and similar ones. Whereas in America, what they're really worried about is the exporting of workers' rights. Because generally workers have a better set of rights in European countries than they do in the US. So this is by no means something that is universally wanted by the people who are living on both sides of the pond. So it really requires some examination, and I would say anyone out there who is interested in it, look up Hertfordshire's Labour MEP, a guy called Richard Howitt. He has been doing an awful lot of work around this, and you know, he's very approachable. You can talk to him about it, and you know, he's been involved in a lot of the trade negotiations that Europe has been involved with. But yeah, it's worrying. But yeah, let's be absolutely crystal clear: Labour will exempt the NHS from TTIP.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for explaining that in a bit more detail. I'm sure people would appreciate that. Final question, really. What would you say, and what will you be saying as you go around doing your canvassing, to the ordinary person in Watford, the regular person in Watford? What will you be saying that will be different in Watford should you be successful and be elected as the MP for Watford?
So I think, well, you're right, we are having lots of conversations with people. I've taken my rosette off, but we were out on the doorstep this morning talking to people. I think, I mean, there's a pretty clear choice at the next election. I don't think that all political parties are the same. I think more than even in 2010, there is a lot of difference between what the different parties are offering people. And I think what I would say to somebody who wants to know what is Labour going to do, well, we're going to do a number of things. We will solve the cost of living crisis. So we will deal with your energy bills, we will deal with train commuting costs and things like that. And we'll reform those markets so that they work better for working people, because at the moment they don't. We will save the NHS properly. You know, you can rely on Labour to be able to deal with the NHS, solve the problems in terms of the doctors and nurses that we need to put into the system, and properly work the integrated social care elements into that, so that you have a single point of contact in terms of your health services, whether they are physical, mental or social. And what we will also do is we will offer we will pay off the deficit, we will build an economy that is oriented around proper growth rather than just reworking some of the debt-driven ideas that have been happening before. We want to have jobs and employment that are full-time jobs, which are what people want. We'll end unfair, exploitative, zero-hours contracts, and we'll make sure that we build an economy for growth. I think that all wraps up to say that we've got a really positive vision for how we can deal with the problems that Britain and Watford is facing today. And I think Labour will deliver this. It's something where you can rely on us to be able to do so. And I don't think that that's a prospect that the other parties are offering.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks for that and wrapping that up. What this is a first round of discussions that we're having with all the different candidates. I've just now got the Greens to do when they announce who their candidate is going to be, and then we're going to start on a second round, which is actually inviting 2 or 3 people from the constituency to come on the show with us, actually, and ask questions rather than me ask questions. Them ask some questions. Would you be happy to do that?
Yeah, I'd absolutely love to. I mean, I think what you're doing here, it's a really exciting, bold initiative to, as you say, put the electorate more in touch with the people who are trying to represent them as their aspiring politicians. So, yeah, very much welcome it, and very, very happy to continue to be involved.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to wrap up there. Thanks ever so much for joining us today, and good luck and with everything. And we'll see you on the next show then, and we'll be in touch to organise that probably during the back end of March.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks very much, Matthew.
Bye.
Bye now.